Well, hello everybody, wherever you are in Queensland. We've got quite a few local government organisations involved in the first of 6 units on the Lunch and Learn series. So it's really exciting that this is the first one that we've got off the ground for the Local Government Association of Queensland. So a warm welcome to you all, and we've got councils from the length and breadth of Queensland on the east and the west, as well as the north and the south. So well done for being involved, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the process and how we go about things. Those of you who are new to this kind of format, a couple of things that are really important. I strongly recommend that you put these dates in your diary so that it's just like any other meeting that you attend. Otherwise, busyness will get in the way and you'll forget. And I think you'll get as much out of the live broadcasts, bearing in mind, of course, you'll get some slides and you'll get the recording as well. So put them in your diary, and I'll send you a note after this, and I'll be sending you a recording plus the slides. And I'd suggest then that, and I'll give you the link, of course, for the next webinar. So as soon as you put the link in, you can put it straight into your diary as well. The other thing that's important is you may well have questions, and I'm very keen to answer your questions. And if you notice over on the right-hand side, there's a little box there called questions. So if you click on that and then you just type in your question, as soon as you think about it, what will happen is I'll see it at this end, and then I'll be able to answer your question in real time. So that's something to remember. I don't want to be left at the end answering a whole lot of questions. It's better to stop and get you involved in the interaction of the activity all the way through. So that's really important. So that's about all I need to say at this stage, except just to sit back and relax. And if you are having lunch, enjoy it. And here we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn off the webcam, because all I'm looking at here is my face and I can't see the slides that I'm presenting to you. So I will take that out of the equation, and then I'll be able to just talk to the slides. Okay. All right, so let's get underway. And there are the 6 modules that we have. Now, bear in mind, you'll get a set of these slides at the end of this presentation, and you'll get a set of slides after every presentation. But you'll notice that in module 2, I've got a couple of little asterisks there. I have to change the date on that, unfortunately. I've got to go overseas, and it was a short notice thing. So I'll be changing module 2 from Friday. It was Friday the 7th of April. I'll be changing that to Thursday the 6th. So hopefully that's not going to create too much inconvenience. And it'll be exactly at the same. It'll be at the same time though. So so just keep that one in mind. But I'll certainly let you know that. I'll give you plenty of warning about that as well when you're involved. You'll notice that the links are. Okay, I've just been told my voice is very low, so I will see what I can do to fix that. Thank you for letting me. I'd be keen to know, of course it can vary depending on where you are with this, so thank you for letting me know. I'll see if I can speak up, or perhaps I can turn the volume up as well. So just bear with me for a moment. Okay, I hope that's better. I hope you can hear me more clearly. That's better, someone's saying. Thanks, Beck. All right, I'm feeling reassured. I'm not talking to myself here. Okay. All right, as I was just saying, there's the modules that we'll be covering. And look, you might say, well, why am I covering those? Well, to me, they're all fundamentally important. I've done a lot of work in local government over the last 15 years. I've had a lot of experience working across a number. In fact, many of you, you may not know me, but I may have worked or done some consulting in your organisation. So, yeah, I'm well and truly familiar with how local government works, and it's just a real honour and a privilege to be joining forces with the Local Government Association of Queensland to present this first, I hope, of many webinar series. Okay, so they're the modules. So in today's session, we're really going to look at the issue of feedback. And as you're probably aware, lots and lots of surveys show conclusively that employees feel, at least, that they're not getting enough feedback from their manager. So hopefully I can give you some tips and hints on how to do that effectively. And guess what? Your homework will be exactly to give more feedback, because that's essentially what we need to do between sessions, is do things slightly differently. All right, I'd like you to just focus in. There it is, it's on the screen now. Have a look at this chart. It's quite interesting because I just want to lead you through this, and I'm going to give you a couple of statistics and a bit of research to start with, and then we'll get stuck into some of the do's and don'ts when it comes to giving feedback to your team. And as I said before, if you've got questions, then just type them in. That will help a lot. So look up the top in the blue bar. It says there, and this is surveys done, and people who receive strength-based feedback, they're engaged. So people who are receiving generally positive feedback, there is a correlation between their engagement levels and the feedback. There's no question about that. And that's great. So that's obviously good news. Now, what about the second line? The second line says that people only receive critical feedback. So they don't get any positive feedback at all, but they get critical feedback. There is still a high level of engagement. And so what that suggests is that any feedback will enhance engagement. Now, of course, it very much depends on how it's done, of course, but all things being equal, giving positive or negative feedback does lead to a level of engagement. How do we know that? Well, if you look at the bottom chart, you'll notice that people who don't receive any feedback are disengaged. So if you're a leader who just, for whatever reason, doesn't give enough feedback, then what you're doing, even though, of course, you wouldn't be attempting to do this, but what you're doing is you are actually disengaging employees. You're disengaging your team members. So you really need to be giving feedback, because if you don't, people will complain about that. They may do it openly, but they may not. So it's really important that you make sure that you do that. So that's the first important point, is that feedback leads to engagement. All right, moving right along, here's some interesting stats and interesting observations. I'd like you to have a think about this and think about how it relates to you as a leader. Roughly by a 3-to-1 margin, employees believe that constructive feedback does more to improve their performance than positive feedback. So there you go. Again, people are saying we want feedback. We understand that occasionally we need to get negative feedback. It doesn't all have to be positive, but we just want some feedback. So that's important. So people are expecting feedback. Now, just because they're expecting it doesn't necessarily mean at the point that they like it. They might come across as not liking it. So there's a difference between an expectation and something you like. In other words, often we like to know where we stand with the law, but when we're outside the law, we probably don't like it. But we do need to know where we stand in relation to feedback. So that's one important point. Now, another point here is that the secret of having employees listen to your feedback is whether or not they respect you. Respect is critically important. Now, if you don't have a high level of respect with the people that work with you, then that's an issue, and that's one that you've got to address quick, smart. But in fact, it doesn't matter how good you are, how much you apply the techniques that you've learnt in this broadcast, it doesn't make a jot of difference if people don't respect you. So, of course, respect has got to be earned, incredibly hard to get, and it requires a degree of authenticity. So that's an important point, that these techniques are only as effective as you are respected as a leader. So of course, if that's an issue, you've got work to do. So you could have exactly the same, you could have exactly the same thing said to two different people with two completely different effects. And that could be based on the perception of respect that they have for you. This is very, very important. So obviously if one respects you and the other one does and one doesn't, you can say the same thing, there are a lot of other variables as well, and get two different responses. So respect is critically important, and I think if you apply many of the things we've gone through, that will help, but at the end of the day, respect is critically important. Now, some of you may be aware, but I've written a book called The End of the Performance Review. So I'm, as you can probably work out, not a great believer in performance reviews, but I also know that many local government environments do have performance reviews, and I also acknowledge that being in that sort of environment, it's very hard to get rid of them. However, my observations and research indicates that they're not always that productive and they're not always that effective. So I wouldn't actually argue that performance reviews are really a form of feedback, although some people would say that they are, but I don't necessarily think it's the case. Nevertheless, some interesting stats around feedback, performance reviews. 30% of performance reviews end up decreasing employee performance, which is quite incredible. In fact, I've never seen any evidence anywhere that performance reviews actually increase performance. I have never seen any evidence of that anywhere. 58% of executives believe that their current program doesn't result in performance or engagement. I think that would be pretty close to the mark in relation to local government. 70% of companies are now recognising their performance strategy, are reconsidering their performance strategy. That's a lot, and you probably read there are companies now getting, big companies too, getting rid of performance reviews and replacing them with performance conversations. And I'm not suggesting you do that, and it may not even be possible, but nevertheless, there's a lot of movement at the station with regard to performance reviews. 2 out of 3 employees with highest performance scores aren't actually the highest performers. So there's a lot to be said for the rating systems that we use in performance reviews, and a lot of managers are reluctant to give people high or low ratings on the basis that if they give them a low rating, they might get very upset and drop the ball. Give them a high rating, they might become complacent, so they tend to give them a middle rating. That's one example, but there are other examples as well. So ratings, of course, are not always as objective as we'd like to think. So there are some issues. 6% of companies surveyed think performance reviews are not worth the time, right? So there is a growing minority of people who really see the whole notion of performance reviews as a waste of time. You might like to think about where you're at with that. 2% of executives say yearly evaluations are useful. So only 2%, that's of HR. So 2%, quite enormous. 80% of team members are dissatisfied with performance reviews. 3% to 5% improvement in performance all managers believe will be generated in the process. Look, these figures are pretty glum and they don't bode well, but I guess my point here is not to have a big conversation about performance reviews, but rather to say to you that performance reviews are not feedback. Feedback is the day-to-day, moment by moment, project by project, incident by incident, circumstance by circumstance, person by person. These are the things that happen in the hallway, they happen in the boardroom, they happen in your office, they happen wherever they happen. feedback can happen spontaneously, and it can also happen in a very prepared way. This is something that goes on and on and on, never stops. Some managers say, oh, I won't bother giving feedback, I'll just wait until the performance review. Too late. You do it right there, right at that moment, which will be one of the issues I'm going to talk about in a moment. Okay, keep the questions rolling in, folks. If you've got any questions or any statement, I'm more than happy for you to do that, because we want to keep this as interactive as we possibly can. Right, let's talk about managing expectations. You have expectations of the people that work with you. So the question is, are you clear about those? And are the people that you lead clear about your expectations? This is the first starting point, and this is very important, because if we haven't got this clear, it won't make a jot of difference how you give the feedback, because people won't know what the expectation is in the first place. So the very first question that we've got to ask and answer is, what are your expectations as a leader? Are you clear about that? That's extremely important. So I'd like you to think carefully about that. Could you explain to people what your expectations are? And this is across a range of technical things and a range of things you do, whether you're in the outdoor or the indoor workforce. You have certain expectations that you want met as a result of getting the work done. Have you communicated those expectations to your team? And I've had people say to me, oh yes, I've done that. And I say, how many times have you done that? I say, oh, I did it the other day. And I said, how many times have you done it? Once. Once is not enough. You've got to do it you've got to continue to do it. You've got to be persistent and consistent all the time. So make sure you let people know exactly where the crossbar is, and don't assume that people know. This is a big mistake that people make. People that make mistakes that they know what's expected of them. I was doing some work in an orchestra a couple of weeks ago, and you know, you can imagine in an orchestra, people come to rehearsals and they're expected to be on time. There is one person who there was one person who basically habitually turned up late, which was a real problem. And the leader of that section didn't broach them about the subject. And I said, why not? And they said, oh, they should know to turn up on time. And I said, I agree they should know, but the reality is they don't know, and you need to explain to them the important expectation of turning up on time. So even something as basic as turning up on time for a rehearsal in an orchestra is not always common knowledge. So make sure you do that. I'm just getting a bit of feedback saying that the audio is dropping in and out. There's not much I can do about that, folks. I'm just going to do my very best. There's no magic button I can press here, but I'll keep ploughing on nevertheless. But thank you for the feedback. The third question that's critically important is, do your team understand your expectations? So it's one thing you communicating your expectations to the team, but do they actually understand what it means? Do they actually understand the context of it? Do they actually understand why it's important? So have you spent enough time explaining why you want things done a certain way and why things have to be done in a certain way? Have you explained why reports have to be, you know, there's got to be a deadline on this particular report? Do they actually know that? Don't assume again that they know that, because that's probably not a very a good idea. Okay, moving right along. Do your team members accept your expectations? This is extremely important, because the reality is that it's one thing you communicating it, it's another thing them understanding it, but it could well be another thing them actually accepting it. Accepting it means they believe it's a fair and reasonable expectation. Now, if someone doesn't think it's fair and reasonable, let me assure you, they're not going to achieve it. So it's good to have a conversation with people around your expectations and whether or not they in fact do accept that particular expectation. Are your team members committed, that should be, are your team members committed to meeting those expectations? Now, a commitment means that they will go out of their way to make sure that they meet what you expect of them. Now, often you can achieve that by asking people for their commitment. So I don't think there's anything wrong with actually saying to one of your team members, can I get your commitment that you'll get this done with the time frame that I've explained to you? Now that's a good thing to say because you want a nod or a grunt or something, a yes, because if you don't get a nod or a grunt or a yes, guess what? It's not going to happen. It just won't happen. So you need to get people's commitment to meet those expectations. And then do people know from you how they're performing against those expectations? So it's one thing you communicating, it's another thing them understanding it, there's another thing them accepting it, there's another thing committing to it, but do they actually know how they're performing to those expectations? And that's the essence of feedback. But really, all of those initial questions have to be answered in the positive for you to have an environment where feedback will flourish and you're creating engaged people who are engaged in your workplace. Really important. Okay, one last question. Am I supporting my team members to achieve those expectations? And I don't mean necessarily holding their hand. What I mean, of course, is making sure they have the resources, making sure they have the support from you in order for them to meet those expectations, which of course is very, very important. Okay, so those are the key questions. Now let's talk about some principles around feedback that I think you'll find useful. And these aren't necessarily in any order, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that one's more important than the other. They're all very important, no doubt. But let's talk about timing. The best time to give feedback is not in the morning or in the evening or at the end of the week or at the beginning of the week, or the best time to give feedback is actually immediately after the incident, whatever the incident might be, both positive or negative. So what I mean by that is that if, for example, you've got somebody in a meeting who's quite negative and you obviously can't give the feedback right there and then in the middle of the meeting, but certainly straight after the meeting you can pull that person aside in private and explain to them that that they were disruptive in the meeting and that created a problem because it reduced morale, blah, blah, blah. The sooner you do it after the event, the more the person understands the seriousness of it, both positive and negative too, by the way. So if you're really happy with the way somebody has dealt with a ratepayer, you might well do that immediately after you overhear them on the phone. Okay? And what signal you're sending, of course, is that this is so critically important that I was willing to down tools to come over and give you that feedback, and that is very important. Okay? So, and of course the same negative. Now just think about it the other way. Let's say that 6 months has passed and you're just about ready to sit down and have a performance review, and you said to the person in the meeting, oh, I forgot, or I didn't get a chance to tell you, but 6 months ago I was just really happy with the way you managed or handled that ratepayer on the telephone. Now, the receiver of that feedback is probably thinking to themselves, well, it couldn't be all that important, because if it was, he or she, that is my boss, would have given me that feedback after the event, you see. So it becomes, timing is critical. The sooner after the event, the better. So timing is very, very important. Now, we all know that it's not always possible to give people feedback straight after the event or the incident. And if that's the case, then I guess the second rule of thumb is as soon as possible, and that might be the next day. But, you know, the sooner you do it, the more immediate it is and the more important it is, because that's what you're doing. You're trying to give and convey a very clear impression that this feedback is important, to the point where nothing else is more important. So that becomes critical, because you want people to follow through on that. Okay, so that's one of the first principles. Now, another principle that's critically important in this whole process is that the feedback has got to be specific. Okay, now generalized feedback is not good, and I know why people do this. People do this because they're worried about, you know, being too specific and being accused of, you know, bullying or you know, harassment of some nature, particularly if it's negative. But generalized feedback, don't forget, is also open to misinterpretation. So be careful with this. So the idea is to be very specific. So let's get back to the issue about someone being negative in a meeting. So if you said to somebody at the end of a meeting, and you pull them aside and everyone else has left, and you've done this in private, so you're doing all the right things, and you say to them, listen, you were very negative in that meeting, that's not specific feedback. In fact, you're probably likely to find that they won't appreciate that whatsoever, because you've made a generalisation. Now, it might appear that they've been negative all the way through, but a far better way to handle that is to say something like this. You made 3 contributions in the team meeting that we just had, and all 3 of them were pointing the finger of blame. Okay, now we're being more specific. And, you know, I guess they can still dispute that, but it's far harder to dispute that when you're actually being very specific about what it is that you're giving feedback about. And it's the same if you're being positive as well. You might say to somebody, you know, oh, that was a great presentation you gave at the meeting today. No, too broad. You might say, that was a great presentation you gave at the meeting today. In particular, I liked the way you handled a couple of difficult questions you got from our boss. Now that's more specific. And then the person knows exactly what you're talking about, which becomes critically important. Okay? So be specific. Very important. Now let me give you some examples, some other examples, because this is an area that people often fall down on. Could I just get some feedback as well from people in the presentation? Am I coming across clearly now? Could you just go to the question box and just say, great, yes, okay, thanks, Beck. Just type something in there. Yep, it's better, great, thanks. Okay, thanks, Marie. Cool, that's great to hear. Because I don't want to be just talking to myself in front of a screen. I can see that there are 12 people or more who have made comment, so obviously I'm coming across well. Okay, good, loud and clear, excellent. Thanks, Lexi. Here are some examples. Look at this example. We'll talk about some positive ones now. Overall, good job on the presentation at the morning's meeting, but it could have been better. All right, that's your feedback. Now, what's wrong with all that? Well, it's positive, so that's a good start, but first of all, it's too vague. What was wrong with it? Plus, just because you didn't like it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. How could it have been better? Well, how about this? How about you said something along the line, here it is, it's up on your screen now. How about you said something like this? Great job at great job on the presentation. I really liked how you used statistics to back up your key points. Right? One small comment. Maybe for next time, it would be a good idea to invite more comments from the group and try and get them more involved. You see how that works? Much more specific, and it's likely to be much more effective as a result of being specific. So timing's important, being specific is important. What else is important? Okay, frequency. Frequency is critically important. Feedback never ends. It's a moment by moment, day by day, incident by incident process. Now, I might just give you a little bit of, give you a preempt about what your homework's going to be as a result of this first unit. Your homework is actually going to be to give 3 bits of feedback every single day. So we know now it's Friday afternoon. I want you, I'm going to challenge you that as soon as you walk away from your screen, I want you to give 3 bits of feedback before you leave to go home this evening. Some of you are thinking, my goodness, that's a big ask. They don't have to be long, can be very simple. A thank you is feedback, or I really appreciate the way you did such and such, whatever. So I want, and if you do that every day, you'll get into the habit of giving more feedback, and you'll find, interesting enough, that people will be more engaged, as I said right at the outset. So frequency is all the time, and one of the best things that I suggest doing is this. When you actually, when you give somebody some feedback, leave the door open. What I mean by that is you say to the person, listen, how about we get back together again in a couple of weeks and have another chat about this? So what I've done is I've left the door open so it doesn't look like I'm sort of hovering around, or I don't trust them, or I'm micromanaging them. If I say to them that I think it's a good idea we get back together, it sends a very clear message to them that yes, this is important, one, and two, I've left the door open. So when you go back to them in a couple of weeks, it's very easy for you to start that conversation by saying, look, I promised that we'd get back together and have a talk about those reports that I asked you to produce. All right, so that's easy to do, and you've kept a promise. That helps build respect, definitely. So it's never ending. So 3 bits of feedback every single day. That's going to be the challenge for you all. And they don't all have to be negative. They can be positive. In fact, good place to start. Be positive. So we've now got being timely, being specific, making sure that the feedback is done frequently. That is, every day. Now, another very important part of feedback is that you've got to get good at asking questions. I know, because I've seen, you know, no, actually I don't know a lot about all of you, but what I could say for sure, having worked a lot in local government, is that many of you are highly technically trained. You have got to your position of leadership because you are very good at your technical expertise. You might be a good engineer, or you might be a good town planner, you might be, whatever it might be, you've been good at it. And of course, people who are good at technical, you know, the technical aspects of their job are good at answering questions. In other words, that's what you're trained to do. I've got a question and I can answer that question for you. Now, as you're a leader, you're actually in the business of asking questions. So this is the important shift that you've got to make to move away from answering questions to asking questions. What sort of questions should you ask? Well, they all start with, 5 of them start with W and 1 starts with H. Why, what, when, who, how, where, which. They're all open-ended questions. In other words, they all require more than a yes or a no. So why did you say that? How did that happen? When did it take place? Who was involved? Now this is important because you're trying to engage the other person in the process. Otherwise it's just you giving them a lecture on, and that's not good. I mean, at the end of the day, you want them involved. You want them seriously involved in the feedback session. This is a dialogue, not a monologue. So ask lots and lots of questions. Now, if you're worried about it, and I know some people don't ask questions because they're worried that they might come across as, you know, a detective or something, just the best question to ask if you're in a difficult situation is, do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions so I can understand the situation? That's a great question. And 9 times out of 10, probably more, the person's going to say yes, they're not going to mind. And then you can go ahead. You've asked them permission to ask a bunch of questions so that you can understand the situation or the scenario far better. And that's exactly what I'm getting at. Keep the questions rolling in, folks, because, you know, I think while you remember the questions, it's a good time to type them in. So just go over to the right-hand side in the question box and type in your questions, and I'm happy to, or comments, and I'm happy to respond to those. All right, moving on. So questions. So what have we got? We have got making sure that the it's timely, it's specific. Okay. We want to make sure that well, I've forgotten what the previous two were. Let's go back and have a look. It's frequent, and we are also asking a bunch of questions. All right, so make sure it's a two-way process. We don't want this to be a one-way affair. It's a two-way approach, and that becomes extremely important. I've just got a question here from Beck. Thank you, Beck. I'll just, if I may, what about stretching the questions by saying something like, tell me more about that? Excellent, Beck. Yeah, you don't have to ask questions. You can actually, this is a technique that Beck's raising called rhythm. That's where you ask a question, right, and they give you an answer, but they haven't given you the whole answer. In other words, they've only given you part of the answer. Instead of you asking another question, why not just say something like, tell me more about that, as Beck's alluded to, or why not say something like go on, you know, as in go on, tell me more, or and, or repeat the words, wrong information. And what it does is it elicits more of the answer. So this can be very powerful and less intrusive than a question-answer process, which creates a kind of a interrogation type of atmosphere. So thank you for that. Yeah, so it's really about getting people to elaborate. All right, so thank you, Beck. That was a great contribution. Let's keep moving. Another very, very important aspect of giving feedback is to do it in private. Now, you know, I know there's things written about, you know, you praise people in public and you chastise people in private. I don't buy into that. I actually think there are some people that get embarrassed when you give them positive praise in public. They're very private people. They don't want to be made the centre of attention. They don't want that. They don't need that. So it's just as effective if you walk up to them in the hallway or you know somewhere perhaps private and just say, look them straight in the eye and just say, look, I just want to say I'm just really, really pleased with the way you have taken on the challenges in this project without having to rely on me too much. I feel that you're really showing a lot of initiative. For example, the other day you did blah. Now, that's just as effective as it would be if you did that in front of everyone, and you may embarrass them. So, you know, I argue that all feedback should be done in private. All right, now some of you may disagree with me, and some of you may love being the centre of attention. Good for you. but not everybody you lead may feel the same way. And remember, this is all about treating people how they want to be treated, not how you want to be treated. So that's the next principle that you need to operate in. Now, another principle that's critically important is to use critical incidents. Now, what I mean by that is that you try and use examples that have occurred in the workplace so that you're not just making, or at least coming across as making, generalizations. So it's very, very important for you to cite examples, and that, if you're doing this in a timely way, obviously the example's right there in front of you. I mean, it's just happened. So talk about an incident, both positive and negative, and use that to anchor your feedback, because otherwise you're going to find you'll be generalizing and the person on the receiving end doesn't really know what you're talking about. And in fact, you might be on the back foot and they actually say, look, I don't know what you're talking about. Can you explain what you mean? That could be all a bit tough. All right. So just talk about the incident. Okay. Very important. In fact, they should always be critical incidents. And of course, if there's a couple, then you might want to talk about a couple, but you don't have to talk about 20. Just talk about one or two. Now, what's very, very important in feedback is to talk about the future. There is absolutely no value in you wallowing around the past. And I find in local government this happens a lot. People are whinging about what's happened in the past. Well, you know what? The past's finished. It's gone. Now, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't learn anything from it, of course, but at the end of the day, all I can focus on as a leader with my team members is the future. So all I can do is get them to change their behaviour in the future. So the focus is on the future. So in other words, if you feel that people are going on and on about making excuses about the past and this happened and so didn't give me this information, and you can just politely stop them and say, look, I understand the situation. What I'm really interested in doing is making sure that this doesn't happen again. And that's my only focus, right? So that's where you go with that. So you don't have to sit there and listen to someone whinging for 45 minutes about something that's happened in the past. I just don't see any value in that whatsoever. So you can politely interrupt them once you understand, of course. I mean, you actually need to know what did happen, of course, but once you know, we don't need to keep talking about it because there's nothing we can do about it. It's happened. It's gone. And that's the other thing that I'd say to you, that when mistakes are made, we're all guilty of making mistakes. There's no point in you saying you should have done this or you should have done that. How can you should have done this or you should have done that now when it was in the past? You can't. I mean, it's gone. Do you see my point? So in other words, if you say you should have spoken to me about this earlier, well, they can't do that. They're in your office now debriefing and it's already happened. So you can't. What you can talk about is what has to happen in the future. So you might say that, look, in the future it might be great if we actually talked a little bit more about this to make sure that it doesn't happen again. All right? Keep the questions rolling in, folks, or the comments or whatever. That it would be great. Moving right along, I want to talk about some guidelines of having conversations on poor performance, because I know that this is the hardest thing to do, and I know that there are lots of people in local government that avoid doing this because they just don't want to open a can of worms or let sleeping dogs lie, or there's all sorts of things around that people. This is what people don't cover this, and honestly, I can tell you now, it isn't going to work. It isn't going to make it any better by not approaching it, right? You think by ignoring it, it will go away. Well, it won't. And secondly, by ignoring it, you're actually giving tacit approval to that poor performance. And that's not good because it reinforces that behaviour. So let's have a look at some of the things that you can do that might help you to tackle poor performance. Again, these aren't necessarily, well, there are in the sort of an order. When you, I mean, obviously you do this in private, as I said before, and when you do this, get straight to the point. So you called a meeting, you've booked the conference room, you've booked that, you've called the meeting, the person's obviously wondering what it's all about. They probably might have some idea, they may not, but they're not completely sure about it. And so as soon as you walk into that conference room, small talk is not good. You don't go there. This isn't about small talk. This isn't about putting the person at ease. The person is not at ease because they don't know what the meeting's about. So why not just tell them straight up front what it's about? Not in a blunt way, just straight to the point. Don't mess around. How's work going? How are you feeling? No, we don't want to go there. That's not what this meeting's about. It's not being authentic. Just say, the reason I wanted to talk to you was that I want to talk to you about your reports that you've produced over the last couple of weeks. All right, so now the person knows what we're going to talk about. That's really important. So if you want to put the person at ease, get straight to the point. Now, they know what the meeting's about, which is really important. Secondly, explain the purpose of the meeting, as I've just explained. You know, get straight to the point. Now, a little bit of advice. The good news about giving feedback on poor performance is that normally you have a little opportunity to think about it. You know, in other words, you can plan. And what I suggest to you is that you actually get a pen and paper out, or you can even do this on your computer, and you just write out the words, a script, in other words. I know that sounds a bit funny, but you actually write out a form of words that you might use to broach this subject. Because let me tell you, the most important part of this meeting is what you say immediately once the meeting starts. So if you can start by having one or two clear sentences that fill all the attributes I talked about before, you're going to be in a great position. Still doesn't mean the person's going to accept it. I understand all that, but there's a better chance of them being able to be receptive to whatever the feedback is if they know that you have confidently expressed to them specifically and using a critical incident what the purpose of the meeting is. That becomes extremely important. All right, so get a pen and pad out, paper, and just write down the words that you're going to use, memorize them, and it'll build your confidence when you have that meeting in that conference room. Another key point here is that once you've explained the scenario, whatever it is, then bite your tongue until it bleeds. In other words, shut up and let the other person talk. This is not all about you talking. This is an engaged dialogue about feedback. So what I suggest is you just let the other person basically, now how do you do that? You might say something like, look, do you have a view about that? Have you got an opinion about that? What do you think about what I've just said? And then you sit back in your chair, I'm assuming you're sitting down, and you just wait for them to speak, and you say nothing. And if you are prepared to wait long enough, they cannot help themselves, they will speak. Silence is one of those ways of getting people to speak that don't normally speak. So encourage, look, and frankly, it doesn't matter really whether what they say you agree with and all that sort of stuff. Just get them talking so that there's a dialogue occurring in the conference room. That's the critically important thing. And here's something that's easier said than done. When they're talking, please don't interrupt them. Bite your tongue until it bleeds. Now they'll probably say, oh, well, you didn't tell me the right information, or I didn't get your email, or whatever it is. And you know in the back of your mind that you did send the email and you did tell them. This is not the place for you to jump in and say, you're wrong, I did send you that email. No. Let them speak. And then when they've said enough, you do what Beck suggested earlier. Is there anything else you want to tell me? Is there anything else that might be useful? And you let them talk. The longer they talk, the more successful, ironically, this whole episode is going to be. Then at the end of that, you can actually say to them, now, there are a couple of things that you said there that I would just like to respond to. You mentioned that you didn't receive an email from me. I know that I did send you that email. So you can correct them, but do it after they have finished speaking. Now, I'll tell you, this is very, very powerful, because if they start interrupting you, you know what you can do, can't you? You can simply say to them, you can say, look, I've given you a chance to say your piece. Now, I would appreciate the same courtesy or opportunity. Now, they can't really argue with that, can they? How can they possibly argue with that when you've done it? That becomes extremely important as well. So, moving right along. Next point. Please avoid confrontation. This is not about having a huge, big argument with somebody. You are not trying to win some sort of competition. In fact, you should use the phrase, I refuse to argue with you about this, or let's agree to disagree if it's a minor point. You're not getting into an argument. They might think you're getting into an argument, but you're not really. So don't go there. It's not about an argument, because in arguments there's a winner and a loser, and often people don't listen to the other person when they're in an argument, so there's no point in arguing about it. All right, so it's very important that you do that. Okay. Right. Secondly, or the next point, focus on performance. So often what happens is that people will have a great tendency to take you off on a fishing expedition, and they'll try and sidetrack you on all sorts of other things. Don't go there. Just gently bring it back to the conversation about the key issue that you want to deal with, because at the end of the day, that's all this conversation is about. It's not about the whole world and all the other things that they want to talk to you about. Got it? So focus on performance becomes extremely important. Now, focus on the future. I mentioned this earlier. It's really important to just say, start to think about how things are going to be different in the future, because actually what you're trying to do is that's all you're trying to do is to change behaviour. If you think about it, all feedback is about modifying behaviour for the future. It's not pointing fingers of blame or being right or wrong or talking about the world's problems. It's really about trying to rectify some behaviour or to reinforce some positive behaviour in the future. That's really important. Focus on the future. Emphasise strengths as well as weaknesses. So look, there must be something positive that somewhere along the line you can throw in. I'm not talking about sugarcoating it, because, it might be quite a serious matter you're talking to them about, but at the very least you can say at the end of the conversation, look, I've got every confidence that you won't do this again, or this will be rectified in the future. Now you can say that with great sincerity, because if you didn't have confidence, why are you bothering to give the feedback anyway? It's obviously a waste of time. So that's positive, but it's at the very minimums of positive, but nevertheless it is positive, and I think it's a fair and reasonable thing that you can say at the end of this conversation. Okay. Another point that's very, very important is seek out the causes. Now again, how you seek out causes is to ask a lot of questions. Why, what, when, who, where, how, and which. Ask questions so that you completely understand. Don't make assumptions about the situation. Ask them, talk to them, find out what it is. so you can get to the very bottom of what it is. And often people are very skillful at not wanting to tell you what the real reason is. So what they do is they skirt around it, and it's a bit of a smokescreen. So you might have to actually ask some questions and draw people out in order to know what's going on. All right, so very, very important. Okay, guys, that brings us pretty much to the end. If you've got questions, please, now's the time, because we're going to we're just about to finish up. So looks as if we're done. But look, homework, guys, just before we finish up, please, I want you to make a commitment to give feedback 3 times a day for the next week. Sounds like a big ask, doesn't it? It's not really. And I want you to start this afternoon. So if you're having lunch now, great, you can do this in the next couple of minutes. Think, where can I start? Or if you haven't had lunch, go and have lunch, and then off you go, give your feedback. You'll feel heaps better by going home for the weekend this evening, knowing that you've done your homework, and then you, of course, if you're in on Monday, do the same thing again, and then again, and then again, and then again. And you know, I don't think it's unreasonable to make a little physical sign somewhere on your computer or your desk or somewhere, three bits of feedback, and just have that somewhere handy where you'll see it on a regular basis, and it'll remind you that it's critically important to give this feedback. So this is the frequency aspect. And then, of course, when you give the feedback, I want you to have a go at balancing it. I want you to make sure that it's specific. I want you to make sure it's based on an incident. I want you to make sure that it's done in private, and all the other attributes that I've talked about. And if you do that, it will, I'm sure, go much better than you probably think. So just before we finish, that's your homework. I'll just put up, there's the screen. I will send you a note very soon, hopefully this afternoon. I'll give you a recording plus the slides that we've done today. And I'll also point out to you, as I have already, that our next module, there'll be a date change. Please put them in your diary, because by doing that, it forces you to make it a priority, and that is very important. Otherwise, you kind of get lost in the whole process. So I'm looking forward to working with you. You are more than welcome to send me an email. You've got my email address. Please send me an email. I'm more than happy to talk to you offline. And if you've got issues that you want to talk about, please do, around feedback or anything else in terms of leadership. I wouldn't mind feedback myself either, so that helps as well. So guys, thank you for your time. Thank you very much for your